just end up disappointed if you rely on others. Believe me, I know.
What was that all about?
Resident Evil Code Veronica has it all. The classic Resident Evil style, survival horror to its core. Fun and intense action, but also a really terrifying setting. New upgraded 3D environments that surprisingly look fantastic even when compared to the original trilogy's pre-rendered backgrounds. A story that is completely off the wall in the best way possible. Villains that are total caricatures, mustache-twirling, maniacal beasts that want nothing but the death of our heroes. And our heroes range from awesome action stars to laughably annoying people. And I say those things with love, because Code Veronica's narrative is just so fun. And even when it isn't goofy and over the top, the new background information provides quite a bit of intrigue to the overarching story of Umbrella. The game also has some of the best cutscenes the series had seen thus far. It looks beautiful, its new setting shakes things up and makes the formula of the series feel fresh, and the story is just a great time. That being said, the game isn't without its faults. Some of the mechanics drag the game down if you don't know what you're doing. It can be very easy to back yourself into a corner, even easier than previous games in the series. The true experience of Code Veronica is almost hidden behind a second playthrough, or a first where you've already been warned of the pitfalls ahead. Despite the drawbacks though, I still do not hesitate to call this game a masterpiece. Those flaws don't ruin the game, they merely prevent it from achieving perfection. And I know this game is a contentious entry in the series, so maybe I'll get some hate for loving this game as much as I do. But playing through this game for the first time, it just appealed to me specifically so much. I love its setting, its environment design, its wild story, its soundtrack, its mechanics, its enemies. Code Veronica is truly an amazing survival horror game. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'll be taking a look at Resident Evil Code Veronica, talking about gameplay, mechanics, story, and everything in between. If you haven't seen the previous videos in the series, I would recommend checking them out now. I will be spoiling some of the events from the first 3 games, so be warned. Each of these videos is meant to represent an era in the Resident Evil series, so I may also talk about some other related games in this video. Also, if you enjoy the video, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, as it really helps me out. You can also support the channel over on Patreon. I've been reviewing the Resident Evil movies over there, and I'm currently on the 3rd movie, Resident Evil Extinction, so be sure to check those out. Hey Dad, it's me, your favorite son, and today I'd like to talk about Resident Evil Code Veronica. By the time that Resident Evil 3 Nemesis had released for the PlayStation 1, development on Code Veronica was already well underway. The team at Capcom was attempting to port Resident Evil 2 to the Sega Saturn. They eventually realized this wouldn't work because the game's quality would suffer from the system's limitations. Because of this, they decided to make a new game for the Sega system as a way of apologizing for the lack of a port and reaching that market. And as the game progressed, they needed more time, which meant the Dreamcast would have to be the home for this game. This allowed the team to shirk the limitations of the Saturn and develop something with far updated graphics. From what I can tell, it seems like Code Veronica was meant to be a spin-off throughout the entire development. Yoshiki Okamoto, a supervisor on Code Veronica, said in an interview that Veronica was actually Resident Evil 3, but he was really just referencing the fact that this game takes place after Resident Evil 2, therefore it is a direct continuation of that story. There's conflicting reports on this, so I can't entirely be sure, but generally it seems like the goal in the beginning was to keep the numbered entry games originally releasing on the PlayStation, and games released on other systems would get subtitles. The biggest goals with Code Veronica, according to director Hiroki Kato, were incorporating a camera that was more free and less fixed, but also using the Dreamcast to their advantage and giving the character models detailed face animations. Kato had been a system planner on the first Resident Evil game, but was given the role of director on Code Veronica. He was heavily focused on scaring the audience, partly because games had stopped scaring him after working on the Resident Evil series. The game had a lot of issues during development, and because Code Veronica was a bigger task, rehauling the formula of the series, they had to outsource a lot of the development. Flagship, an independent company that was started by Yoshiki Okamoto, helped develop the scenario. They had previously done work on Resident Evil 2. Nextech and Toze were responsible for the technical side, polygons and stuff like that. The art direction and story were done by the team at Capcom. Resident Evil Code Veronica was released on February 3rd, 2000 in Japan, March 28th, 2000 in North America, and May 26th, 2000 in Europe, all for the Sega Dreamcast. Of course, it's Resident Evil, so this comes with the caveat of multiple different versions of the game across many platforms. Technically, the only platform to get this original version of the game was the Dreamcast, because 1 year later, Capcom would release Code Veronica X. This version of the game added some extra cutscenes and story content, which we'll talk about later. The game was also ported to PlayStation 2, GameCube, and PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 stores digitally. Personally, I preferred the look of the original Dreamcast version. There was an HD remaster of the game that was also released in September of 2011. I really do not like the look of this version, and since the version that I liked the best was the original, it seemed only fitting that this was the one I played. Most of the footage in this game will come from the original Dreamcast version of the game, but don't worry, we'll talk about the altered and extra content from the X version of the game later. Resident Evil Code Veronica begins with a text crawl, Star Wars style. These words recap the events of Resident Evil 2 and 3, mostly. It focuses on Claire, since she will be the main character for this entry. We jump ahead 3 months later as Umbrella helicopters are flying to Rockfort Island. Claire has been captured and is being processed. She's knocked out with the butt of a gun and loses consciousness. 10 days ago, Claire infiltrated the Paris Umbrella lab looking for her brother Chris. This is part of the reason that I love Code Veronica so much, that it finally follows up on a question that the series feels like it's been asking for a while. Where is Chris Redfield? In Resident Evil 2, we're told that he left to track down Umbrella's HQ in Europe. In Resident Evil 3, we see him moving around and staying out of sight, still on the trail of the evil pharmaceutical company, and we haven't truly seen the character physically present in a game since the first Resident Evil. In Code Veronica, we're finally gonna get some answers. Claire is running through the Paris facility, chased by a helicopter, chased by guards. In these last 3 months, Claire has become a full-blown action star. As an army of Umbrella soldiers set their sights on the girl, she drops her gun and fires a bullet into the tanks behind them, taking the force out in one shot. A single soldier gets the jump on Claire though, and she's taken into custody. This is where we find Claire, behind Umbrella bars, on an unfamiliar island somewhere in the South Pacific. The man that captured her slowly saunters in, a wound in his stomach. This is Rodrigo Juan Raval, and he tells Claire that the facility has been attacked, that she should leave this place. Rodrigo isn't sure who attacked, all he knows is that their troops have been wiped out. Rodrigo passes out before he can say much else, and with our freedom in hand, we can leave this place. Before we get too deep into the story of Code Veronica, we should probably talk about how the game plays and what changes it makes in terms of the series. The bones of Code Veronica are firmly set in the Resident Evil series. The game is survival horror. We use weapons to fell zombies and BOWs. Ammo is limited, feeding back into the horror that the game presents. We use and combine herbs to restore our health or get rid of our poison, and we search for key items and solve puzzles to continue forward. Much of the fundamentals haven't changed, except you'll note that I omitted one thing from that brief description: fixed camera angles. And that's because the camera, technically, isn't always fixed in this entry. Code Veronica makes one huge change to the series in that it ditches the pre-rendered backgrounds that the original trilogy had. In its place, Code Veronica introduces a full 3D world, with modeled items making up the environments rather than static images. This enables the camera to move with the character at certain points. Sometimes we'll be walking across an area and the camera will track our character, or it will swoop across to another fixed point as we enter a new side of the area. This doesn't mean that the camera always follows this style. Sometimes the camera sticks itself in one spot and doesn't change until we move out of that area. Obviously, the previous games weren't capable of making this upgrade because you can't change the perspective on a scene that relies on a static background. Now, this changes the feeling and style of Code Veronica in a drastic way. The static cameras of the previous games lended themselves well to horror. It felt as if we were observing the scene from a distance, as if cameras had been placed around a facility and we were watching and controlling the action as it unfolded. Now that the camera moves, it feels a bit more cinematic, combining film with the interactivity that games provide. In the case of Code Veronica, this change lends itself well to the narrative. Code Veronica places more of a focus on its story, probably more than any other game in the series so far. The 3D backgrounds also just look fantastic. I love the modeling style of this era, and in terms of actual fidelity, it is a step up from the previous games. Whether you actually prefer pre-rendered backgrounds or full 3D environments is entirely up to you. In my opinion, they both have their strengths. Pre-rendered backgrounds can look beautiful, and the images used in the first 3 Resident Evil games were incredibly detailed, but the 3D backgrounds also allow the camera to shift scenes and change positions without the awkward loading pause that we had in previous games. Since changing perspective requires loading in new images, we would get a slight pause when we move to a new scene within the same area. In Code Veronica, we don't have that, which makes things a whole lot smoother when it comes to exploration and combat. One thing that Code Veronica doesn't get as right as the previous games, I feel, is just how impactful the guns are. In particular, the M93R and Glock 17 pistols just don't really feel like they pack a punch. The fire rate has been increased quite a bit from the PlayStation 1 games, giving us more freedom to let loose a full magazine into zombie heads, but the bullets themselves don't feel like they do as much damage. This goes for the crossbow handgun as well, something that we'll use a lot in Code Veronica just because of how much ammo there is. This thing really feels incredibly weak though. It takes a ton of bolts to even get an enemy down, let alone kill them. This is offset just by how many weapons we can get in Code Veronica though. A new addition to the series are dual-wielded weapons. While we can't select specific weapons to store in each hand, we can pick up certain weapons that can be dual-wielded. The Ingram and M1000P in particular. When using these weapons, we can shoot at 2 enemies at once, or focus on one enemy based on the distance between us and zombies. Using these things is just so much fun, and once again creates a cinematic feel, specifically something from a B-action movie. Director Hiroki Kato stated that the introduction for the game was inspired by The Matrix and John Woo films, and it feels like we can see some of that in the game itself as well. Code Veronica also has upgradable weapons, a magnum, a shotgun, a sniper rifle, a grenade launcher, and an assault rifle just in its main campaign. This offsets the lack of impact in the main weapons just a bit, though I do think weapons like the AK-47 leave a lot to be desired. Code Veronica's biggest changes, though, are in enemies, story, and various mechanics that the game will introduce as we get through its runtime. So let's start talking about the story. As we leave the cell area, we are greeted with a new type of transition screen. As you're probably aware by now, Resident Evil contains small loading screens in between areas that showcase a first-person perspective as we walk upstairs or open doors. In Code Veronica, though, at certain points we'll get slower transition screens. These feature the deliberate walk up the stairs or a measured turning of a doorknob. These adjusted scenes are usually only used on first entry into specific areas, but they beautifully play on the fear that these loading screens originally excelled at. In my video on the first Resident Evil game, I made the case that these loading screens gave the player a moment to wonder what could be behind the door. They abstract the idea of the door into a form and break it down into its most terrifying incarnation, a representation of the unknown, a precipice, a threshold. Code Veronica uses this to its advantage when the player is unaware. When we haven't been through this door or up these stairs, Code Veronica slows the transition down and allows the fear to build for even longer. A heartbeat sound effect is included in the background to further build on the tension of entering the next area. Is a horde of zombies waiting for us on the other side? Is a pack of zombie dogs? A new enemy entirely? A difficult boss fight? We aren't sure, but the choice to enter has already been made. There's certainly no turning back now, no room for cowardice once the line has been crossed. And because of this, the developer can torture the user as much as they'd like by increasing the fear that we experience. As we exit out of the cells, Claire finds herself in a nearby graveyard. A crashed truck that we pass by when entering the area explodes, letting out a briefcase that's now encased in flame. This is something we'll have to come back to when we have the necessary key items, but the preceding explosion has awakened the zombies in this area, and since we're only armed with a knife at this point, we need to leave quickly. We're dropped into trouble just as quickly as we get out of it, though. Claire is immediately shot at by a turret and is forced to take cover. As soon as she returns fire, Steve, the man controlling the turret, realizes she isn't a zombie and comes down to introduce himself properly.
Wait right there. I'm coming over.
And with the thickest Canadian accent ever, straight out of Degrassi The Next Generation, we meet Steve.
That little misunderstanding. But I thought you were another one of those monsters.
Shut up! Make one wrong move and I'll shoot!
Relax, beautiful. I said I was sorry.
Steve immediately begins hitting on Claire and tells her that he was a prisoner here too. Steve plans to get to the airport on the island and make an escape, so he heads off and tells Claire to stay behind because she'll only slow him down.
Well, I'll see ya.
Hey, wait up!
I don't want you following me, lady. You'll only slow me down.
Now, a lot of Resident Evil fans fucking hate Steve, and honestly, I get it. Steve is whiny, he's kind of a creep, and he makes our lives infinitely harder. If Steve wasn't such an idiot, Code Veronica would be a much shorter game. So I understand why people dislike him, but man, I love Steve. Steve is so stupid and dumb, and his voice acting is over the top. It just makes for some really great moments. I'll dive deeper into his character as his arc goes on, but I just wanted to establish early that I will not be boarding the Steve hate train. As we leave this area, we're introduced to the first section of the game, the prison. The prison is mostly marked by its unfeeling structure. Most buildings are constructed from deteriorating wood or simple brick. Little decoration will be found here. Everything outside of a few distinct areas is crafted with the goal of utility. Torture devices and bloody instruments abound. As Claire makes her way through this place, we can enter the barracks nearby to find the diary of a prisoner. The prisoner had befriended another inmate named Bob. Bob used to be an attendant to the head of this island, a man named Alfred, but Bob made a tiny, unnamed mistake and was placed here. The prisoner eventually realizes that Bob and the other prisoners have been taken away to be experimented upon, and he knows that he's next on the literal chopping block. Exploring this place, we're attacked by a zombie through a glass window. This enemy luckily has a pair of M1000Ps on him that we can take and dual wield. Claire makes her way into a nearby building that has a metal detector. If we don't place all of our metal items in the storage box before entering, the facility will be locked down and we will not be allowed entry. Upon heading through, we find Steve accessing a computer. He's found Chris Redfield's name listed in the database and asks Claire about her relation to him. Chris is on the computer because he's being surveilled by Umbrella. She wants to send Leon the information so that he knows Chris is being watched. Steve makes the suggestion that Claire should call her brother here, and then there's a really weird interaction.
Why don't you send your brother the coordinates and ask him to come help?
Thanks, I'll do that.
Hey, I was just kidding. There's no way he could get here, even if he is your brother.
Yes, he can, I'm sure of it.
No way. He won't come. You'll just end up disappointed if you rely on others. Believe me, I know.
What was that all about?
Apparently Steve has a bit more baggage than we can tell right now, but he's gone, so that's for later. In this room, we can find a hawk emblem that will need to leave the prison proper. There's only one issue. We can't get it through the metal detector. We actually can't take any of the ammo that we find in here either because it'll set the detector off. To get around this, for the hawk emblem at least, we have to grab a fire extinguisher and head back to the crashed truck. We can put out the fire and open the briefcase, which gives us a sample of TG01. This was an experimental substance that the lab was working on, something that held similar properties to metal, but could be passed through metal detectors without setting them off. It seems like this was being developed for weapons applications. I'm sure you can imagine why being able to get a gun through a metal detector would be useful to the right people. We can head back into the lab and make a copy of the hawk emblem with the TG01 material and use it to head to the bridge. The bridge will connect us to the next large area of the game, the palace. Entering this building, we're greeted with a new style for the series. Code Veronica has traded in Resident Evil's mostly American environment design and building structure for a Gothic European theme. I personally love this change, and I think it gives the series a fresh coat of paint. Not only that, but you'll also see that it fits this entry's themes and story very well. It also ends up making the first trilogy feel like a separate thing. This game isn't trying to retread the same old ground, but to carve out its own path. Rather than stepping on the legacy that those games have already made for themselves, go somewhere new. A lot of the soundtrack reflects this as well, songs that have a booming sort of echoing feel, as if they're being played in a space with massive vaulted ceilings. You can hear the songs in the room rather than in your speakers. The Palace of the Insane is one of my favorite tracks. It's this slow, atmospheric build and swell to a crescendo that never comes. Anticipation without the payoff. The thumping and pointed keys on this track emulate the deliberate steps taken through the place, the thumps in the background, the sounds of enemies behind the door. The suspended doll feels like it takes this piano usage and runs with it as well. It uses what sounds like synths to emulate grand organs, feeding back into the Gothic feel. The save room theme is one of my favorites in the series, though. While the first 3 games had save room themes that felt like they were relieving the tension for a moment, they also kept that horror and intensity in the background. There was still a fear in these tracks, something sinister was lurking beyond. Code Veronica feels like it does actually give you a moment of relief, the track being titled just that. The song is a lot more glittering and mystical than the other save room themes. It feels like wishing for better times, or better yet, a hopeful determination. The song is reflecting the foresight of understanding the end goal. We will not die here in this hell, but overcome and manage to fight again. It is the joy of another day. While the palace's architecture may have changed, the application is still the same. It resembles a lot of the labyrinthine attributes that the Arclay mansion held. We will branch out from this place, backtrack, and move to other areas. It's not exactly our central location, but it's one of them for a while. In the safe room upstairs, we can find a secretary's note, written by none other than Bob from the previous prisoner's diary. Alfred, the head of this island, was living at a private home on the hill. Bob tried to ask him about this many times, but he was always shirked off and told not to speak of it. The rumors were that he lived with his twin sister, Alexia, but Bob never actually laid eyes on her. Downstairs, we can enter the collection display room, where tons of model tanks, weapons, and knives are on display. It's a room that seems to be dedicated to war or combat in some way. Interacting with a strange ant on the wall will cause a projector to play a video of two kids. In the video, the boy pulls the wings off of a dragonfly and places it in a tank full of ants, allowing the creatures to devour it. This activates a switch and opens the back room. Here, we can try to take a pair of gold Lugers, but we're locked inside and have to put them back. Heading back outside, we'll hear Steve crying for help. We can find that he has activated the same trap, but is locked inside. We can save his ass, and he shows us the Lugers that he's discovered, as if we didn't already discover them. So this is probably strike number 1 that Steve gets in the minds of the fans. He takes the Lugers and runs away, telling us that he'll only give them to us if we trade him for a fully automatic weapon.
Oh, I need those. Give them to me.
You gotta be kidding. I found it and I'm keeping it. Fine. Let's make a deal. I'll trade you for something fully automatic.
Now, we need these weapons, because even though we can't actually use them, they act as a key item that will allow us to get into the next area of the game. So that's kind of an annoying thing for a character to do, especially with no reason given whatsoever. He just thinks they're cool. Dealing with Steve is sometimes like dealing with a child, but how hilarious is that, right? That we just have this guy that is incredibly overconfident, who doesn't care about the hell around us, and is just getting into trouble at every turn. Damn, I love Steve. In all seriousness, this is a stark contrast to how other games handled level progression. For example, in Resident Evil 1, one of the early goals was to gather the emblems that would allow us access to the transition area that would take us to the guardhouse. Now, our goal for this section is to get an automatic weapon so that Steve can have something to play with instead of the gold Lugers. I'm sure you can imagine why that would rub people the wrong way. Heading back into the main room, Claire will be fired upon yet again. A strange man with a strange voice already knows who Claire is.
I have no idea what you're babbling about.
You don't fool me! I am Alfred Ashford, commander of this base.
Alfred accuses Claire of intentionally getting caught and leading the special forces here to destroy his base, and Claire burns his ass hard.
Oh? You must be one of Umbrella's lower level officers if you're in command of a backwater base like this one.
How dare you!
Alfred tells her that the Ashford family is one of great prestige and that his grandfather was one of the original founders of Umbrella. He keeps trying to get answers out of Claire, but as we know, Claire doesn't know anything. But Alfred is ready to play some games with Claire, treating her as a rat in a cage until he's done. We can head outside and use a boat wheel that we found earlier to activate a submarine that will allow us to head to the airport and possibly leave this place. In the submarine, we get access to a supply pack that will give us 2 extra inventory slots, something that's already dearly needed even this early in the game. We can investigate the airport a bit, which has also been overrun with zombies at this point. But our main goal here is grabbing the biohazard card, which will allow us access to the military facility outside of the palace. Heading into this area, we're attacked by the Gulp Worm. We can actually just avoid it as Claire, though it will be a thorn in our side when we're trying to get from area to area. The thing burrows underground and blasts out of the dirt, and if we're hit, we'll take a decent amount of damage. Heading into the facility, we can find a bowgun, which, as I said before, is a pretty limp-wristed instrument of death, but it works when we're in a bind. We need to get a passcode for a nearby room that's on lockdown, but the only place we can get that code is from inside of the room, on a painting of a skeleton in the back. We'll have to figure out some other way to see inside for now. One gripe that I do have about Code Veronica is that it doesn't have any dynamic puzzle solutions. Resident Evil 3 introduced these and used them throughout the course of the game. meaning that a lot of the puzzles would have different solutions. The solutions in Code Veronica are fixed, and while you can't technically call it a downgrade since Resident Evil 3 and Code Veronica were being developed at about the same time, it sure feels like a step in a backwards direction. As we leave the room, emergency alarms are sounded and a researcher is killed inside the lab. Since the facility has detected an outbreak, the shutters will begin to lower and Claire barely makes it out in time. We can use a card to raise one of these shutters and get a key from a fountain, eventually stumbling into Alfred's sights once again. He almost kills Claire, and we actually have to dodge his laser and chase him down. He escapes into a nearby room, and once we arrive, he's nowhere to be found. In this area, we can find a hemostatic, a medicine designed to stop bleeding. If you manage to really explore the beginning area of the game, you'll find an empty vial of hemostatic by Rodrigo. This is optional, but after obtaining this, we can head all the way back to the start of the game and give Rodrigo this hemostatic to stop his wounds from killing him. Claire will leave him the lighter that we start the game with, and in return, he gives us the lockpick set. We can use these lockpicks to open the various briefcases that we find throughout the game. Some of them just contain explosive arrow powder, but one contains an upgrade for Claire's gun that can make it automatic. But for now, we need to head forward, and Alfred shows his control of the facility as he locks us in a room, taunting Claire from a nearby speaker. Heading through the next door, we're introduced to a new enemy, and perhaps the most interesting enemy of the game, the Bandersnatch. These monsters were essentially a cost-effective answer to the Tyrant. Tyrants were expensive to make and hard to come by for Umbrella, since not everyone matched the genes required to make them. The Bandersnatch can actually elongate its limbs, and looking at the concept art for the monster, done by Satoshi Nakai, it seems like the monsters were originally meant to breathe through their shoulders and use compressed air to stretch their arms. The main inspiration for the character was actually Dalsum from Street Fighter. Going up against these enemies is actually a pretty big pain because they can attack us from afar. Even if we're running away, we can still get tagged. They can also change levels in different environments, which I thought was a nice touch. We're attacked by another one as we head downstairs, but luckily Steve jumps in through the window, Max Payne style, to save Claire. Since we grabbed the submachine guns in the last room, we can trade them to Steve to finally get the gold Lugers that he's been holding hostage. He's of course upset at the fact that they don't come with any ammo.
This thing is too cool. Yes! Now this is my kind of weapon. All right! Huh? Hey, this thing's empty. You cheated me.
Claire helps him get some ammo nearby, and the tone of this relationship seems to have changed slightly. Claire isn't completely annoyed with Steve anymore, she's starting to come around. As the two talk, Alfred lowers the platform they're on down into the underground. Steve, of course, quickly runs off again to test out his new weapons, but we actually get to play him for a brief section. We can run through this area and clear out the zombies for Claire.
It was dirty work, but this area is now clean. See? You can depend on me.
And then Steve says something really weird.
You see? This thing is a lot more reliable than any person.
Than people?
Claire tries to get at Steve's origins, but he's angsty and mysterious, so he runs off once again. We follow Steve into the elevator downstairs, and both he and Claire fall through the floor. Steve is attacked by a zombie almost immediately, but he hesitates to shoot it. That is, until it comes after Claire, and pretty quickly we find out why he won't shoot this specific zombie in the funniest way possible.
Father! Father. Father. Father.
We then get Steve's background story in full. His father worked for Umbrella and was trying to steal information from them to sell to their competitors. He was caught, Steve's mother was killed, and they were sent here as prisoners. I guess this explains why Steve thinks that he can depend more on weapons than people, and maybe why he wanted the gold Lugers in the first place. Claire tries to comfort Steve, but we leave him blubbering on the floor to try and find a way out of here. Nearby, we can get access to an elevator, which allows us to travel the floors of the facility. We can get an eagle emblem that gives us another card. This allows us to unlock the shutters in the building, which have been locked down since Alfred sent the place into alert status. The command center will allow us to view a presentation about albinoids. These are a new enemy that we'll face later in the game, but Umbrella created them by combining the T-virus with the genes of a salamander. They grow at an increased rate and can also use electricity somehow. The nearby command console will allow us to finally see the code for the previously locked room though. Inside that room we can grab the painting itself, which is the key to a later puzzle. An albinoid then breaks out and attacks Claire. This causes the facility to go into lockdown once again, so we have to run before the clock hits 0. The painting goes into the diorama room, which unlocks a hidden model of the facility itself. We can head back to the palace and get access to the painting room, which actually gives us a ton of information about the Ashford family. There's a painting of each of the important members of the family, including one of the founders of the Umbrella Corporation as a whole, and Veronica Ashford, the founder of the Ashford family. This is basically the lore room. The Ashfords were all gifted artifacts when they became the master of the family. Alfred specifically was gifted an earthenware vase. Alfred's father was also the one that sort of ran the family into the ground. Alfred had a heavy burden on his shoulders though, because he was the one that was given the responsibility of building the family back up. We can find the vase behind Alfred's painting, which has a jeweled queen ant inside. With the gold Lugers, we can head to the next area of the game, the private residence. This is Alfred's personal home, located up on a hill nearby. There's a bridge that connects the palace to the private residence. And it's worth pointing out how damn good this shot looks. As we walk up to the house, the fog rolling in above the steps, the foliage pushing out of the sides, the lightning off in the distance, it just looks great and sets the tone for the place we're about to visit. This place holds some knowledge and some reveal that we aren't ready for. As we enter the house, a group of Bandersnatches are ready for us. The house itself is a gaudy, over-the-top, covered in velvet residence. You can see the excess on the walls and decorations, a huge juxtaposition from the prison and the bunks that we start out in, where the patients and test subjects are held. Climbing to the top of this building sees swarms of bats attacking us. Luckily, we can fend these flying enemies off by equipping the lighter. Once we get to the top, we can listen in on a conversation between Alfred and his sister Alexia. She is demanding that Alfred revive the family as fast as he can. He plans to seat Alexia at the top. Both of them repeat their relationship over and over again, saying brother and sister at the end of every sentence. It honestly reminds me of the way that Buster from Arrested Development talks.
Glorious Ashford family, do not worry, brother.
Hey, brother. We can head back to the palace at this point to get the eagle plate and find a note to see that Hunk was working with the Ashfords, transporting an experimental BOW to their facility. This is where we can head back and get the lockpick from Rodrigo, but also use the eagle plate to access another area of the prison facility. Another weakness that a lot of people point out in Code Veronica is its backtracking, and this is another point that I will agree on. It does feel like we often have to retread old ground in Code Veronica, and sure, that happened a lot in the first 3 games as well, but I think Code Veronica just has quite a bit more of it. It's also worsened because most of the game is split up into 2 large areas, and the game is a bit longer than the previous entries. But in the end, we head to the residence, back to the prison, back to the residence, over and over. It just crosses the line to becoming a bit too much. Heading into the new area in the prison allows us to get those items that we left in the metal detector at the beginning of the game. I thought this was a genius little moment because the whole game I was wondering if I had done something wrong. I thought maybe there was another way to get those items out of the facility and I had just missed it. But it turns out you just have to have some patience and get into the facility from another direction. The goal at this point in the game is to gather all 3 army proofs to activate an elevator that lets us into the escape plane. We already got one earlier in the game, but the other 2 come from this section. We can find a torture chamber under the prison that gives us a piano scroll. This can be used back in the palace to unlock the other queen ant. This allows us to go all the way back to the private residence and access a secret chamber in the twins' rooms. We can find a note from Alfred in this chamber where he confesses his undying, totally familial, by the way, love for his sister. He wanted his sister to revive their family and to only be seen by nobles, to reign over the world as queen. On the way back downstairs, we're confronted by Alexia herself as she wields a rifle.
We meet each other at last. A pity I must say goodbye so soon. I am Alexia Ashford. For the pride of the Ashford family, I will kill you.
She shoots at Claire before Steve arrives once again to save the day. He does manage to fend her off, but he's shot in the process. See, how can you hate Steve when he took a damn bullet for us? The two head after her, but they are quickly attacked by Alfred. But when he catches a glimpse of himself in the mirror, he freaks out and runs off. With a blonde wig nearby, Claire correctly deduces that Alfred thinks he's both Alexia and Alfred. Alexia might not even be real. With this, though, the facility has gone on alert, and we have enough of the proofs to get to the plane. Other vehicles are already escaping this place, and even when we get to the escape plane, we need to open the door first to leave. We can do this from a control panel, but on the way back, Alfred/Alexia unleashes a new monster for us to fight. This is a tyrant, just like the one that we fought in the first game, but it's much stronger. A countdown has started as well before the facility will self-destruct. The tyrant attacks us on the way back to the plane, and we get a short boss fight on a narrow bridge. This fight is really simple, especially if we got the rare BOW rounds from the prison area of the game. These do way more damage than normal, but there's only a few of them. We can get back to the plane, which Steve pilots out of Rockfort Island. Claire and Steve are going to get their idyllic ending. Steve apologizes for before, and he hopes that Claire can find Chris, because he knows what it's like to lose his family. Claire and Steve plan to leave for Hawaii, and the game ends. Just kidding. Alfred is back in the prison and launches a tank that allows him to access a secret underground escape route. In the lab underground, he pilots his own jet out of the base. Claire and Steve's plane is attacked, and we have one more boss battle before the next stage of the game. The tyrant has invaded the cargo hatch of the vehicle, and we have to push him out. The goal here is to weaken him and use a panel nearby to launch a container which will push him out of the plane. It's honestly not that hard if we have the right ammo, like the BOW rounds from before, or the explosive bowgun rounds, which do quite a bit of damage. The cargo area is also a pretty tight location, and we can also get pushed out of the back of the plane. Once the tyrant is gone, we don't have to worry about him anymore. Unfortunately, though, Alfred arrives to ruin our party pretty quickly. He takes control of the plane, and Claire and Steve can do nothing but go along for the ride. The two of them pass out as the plane flies on autopilot, and there's this odd sort of romantic scene with this glittering track in the background as Steve tries to sneak a kiss while Claire is sleeping. The two pretty quickly realize that they're in the Antarctic, and the plane begins to nosedive. This is another one of the FMVs in this game that just looks absolutely insane for the time. The facial animation on the characters looks great, the way the plane crashes into the building, the rubble falling, it's fantastic. In general, Code Veronica has had quite an upgrade in the cutscene department. Hell, even one of the first cutscenes, when Claire is sitting in her cell waiting for Rodrigo to walk in, you can see her eyes shaking. The detail here is just insane for the time. As the two crash into this facility, this marks the end of the first half of the game and the moment where the game wants us to switch to the second disc. Claire and Steve wake up and escape the crashed plane, with Claire falling into Steve's arms. After their slightly romantic moment, they decide to split up and find a way out of this place, or figure out where they even are in the first place. This is actually an Antarctic research facility operated by the Umbrella Corporation. This is effectively our underground base for this entry. We quickly learn that this facility was established undercover by Alexander Ashford, the son of Edward, who founded the company with a man named Oswell E. Spencer. Spencer and Edward had found the progenitor virus, or the original version of the T-virus that led to their research. The T-virus was just a variation of the progenitor. Alexander planned to use this secret Antarctic facility as a way to continue his research, and he codenamed his project Veronica after the founder of their family. He even had a room built and commissioned after the Arclay Mountains mansion so that he could retain his memories of the place. In a hidden compartment of the safe room, we can find a locker where a rat is making noise and jumps out when we arrive. So, we gotta talk about this rat for a second. A really weird detail about this game is that this rat seems to be sentient and can write full sentences on paper. We can find a secret diary in the battle mode of the game to learn that this rat's name is D.I.J. and has been following and watching Claire for the entire game. Weird note, not really a big plot point or anything, it's just kind of there. More interestingly, we can find the butler's letter in this locker as well. He feels bad for Alfred since he had to deal with his father's disappearance and also his sister's death at a young age. So apparently Alexia died a long time ago and Alfred has taken on her persona at this point. Out in the hallway, we see some sort of nest has formed and we get easily the most annoying section of Code Veronica. This hallway is full of moths, and these moths will attack us, planting eggs in our back. These eggs will hatch even if we leave to the next room, which is a pretty damn cool mechanic for sure, but when this egg hatches, we're poisoned. Now, there's a pot full of blue herbs nearby that we can use to cure our poison, but it's in the same hallway as the moths, so as soon as we exit, we get attacked again. The only course of action here is to kill the moths, but they just respawn as soon as we leave the area. It's an incredibly annoying mechanic to deal with, and it's only worsened by the fact that this hallway is directly outside of the safe room, meaning that we'll have to return here many times before this section of the game is done. The general goal of this section is to get a large piece of machinery that can dig a hole in the ice to get Claire and Steve out of the facility. Investigating another secret compartment, though, allows us a glimpse at a horrific sight. Some man or creature has been blindfolded and chained up underground. A monstrous creation that's not allowed to leave, not allowed to die, caught in a state of endless stasis. Later, Steve and Claire find the machinery they need to break out, but Steve is too busy ogling Claire's ass and he runs the machine into a pipe, causing a massive gas leak. Oh, Steve, you rascal. Steve is starting to lose hope, but eventually finds it again in Claire.
It's all my fault.
Don't say that. Listen to me. We'll escape from here. Together.
This romance is just so funny to me. Like I said before, I totally get why people don't like it. What in Capcom's right mind made them think that people would warm up to Steve? He makes our life harder in every regard. He constantly fucks things up. He almost feels like an antagonist when he's introduced. The first time we see him, I almost thought he was closer to a character from Silent Hill than Resident Evil, echoing shades of Eddie. And then halfway through the game, suddenly Claire loves him. I guess you just have to imagine that Claire is endeared and charmed by his relentless fuck-ups and his ability to open up to her. Once we get a valve to shut off the gas leak, Alfred shows back up and Steve saves the day once again, blasting him with his submachine guns and causing Alfred to fall into the chasm below. We then see this imprisoned man from before. His heart opens and the binds holding him at bay are released as he makes his way out of his cell. We can grab Alfred's sniper rifle off the ground, which is good because we'll need it. Claire and Steve then make their way out of the facility. Wait, Steve has something to say.
Are you ready? I'm gonna bust.
The facility is flooded as Claire and Steve make their escape into the open Arctic. They make their way onto the helipad, and as they try to leave, the blinded creature is coming after us. Steve is thrown off of the helipad, and we have our next boss battle. Here we have to fight Nosferatu, who can kind of be a pain, honestly. Nosferatu will wander around the arena, using his tentacles to shoot poison columns out at us. If we get too close to the edge, he can actually knock us off. We can do damage to him with normal weapons, but the way to do the most damage is, by far, to shoot his exposed heart with the sniper rifle. It's a bit of a difficult shot because we need to be close enough to hit him that his body isn't obstructed by the snow falling, but not close enough to get hit by his attacks. We can really only get 1 or 2 shots off though before we're assailed by poison clouds and forced to find a new position to shoot from. I will say, even though this fight can be a bit clunky, it's one of my favorite fights in the series so far. Because we need to aim for Nosferatu's heart, it feels like the battle actually has mechanics. Most of the boss battles we've seen so far have just been about dealing damage and avoiding damage, and at the end of the day, that's what all boss battles are, right? But this fight incentivizes us to use a bit more precision than we would have in the past, which is a great change. I don't mean to knock the previous boss battles in the series either. This one just feels like it's pushing into the next era that the series would fall in. Nosferatu's design is also just gorgeous. I have a soft spot for characters with blindfolds on. It's a cheap and easy way to make me think that a character looks cool, because, let's be honest, it is. Also, the hands tied behind his back makes it feel like this man has lost his humanity, and the virus inside of him has taken over. He can no longer use his God-given appendages, but the ones derived from man playing God. It's the simplicity and storytelling in flipping the simple human form on its head and juxtaposing straightforward features within character design. After we manage to kill Nosferatu, he falls dead on the helipad. Claire saves Steve as he's still barely hanging on to a broken piece of steel off the edge of the structure. Steve feels like he's failed Claire and promises to protect her next time. The two resolve to get the hell out of here, finding a vehicle nearby that can take them to the Australian base.
Perfect! We'll be able to ride right over to the Australian base with this.
This was something that never really made sense to me. This base is in the Antarctic. How are they getting over to the Australian base with a snowmobile? I guess they could have meant that they were heading to a base that is operated by the government of Australia, but it was really just such an odd and kind of confusing choice of words. We then see Alfred underneath the base, limping along, still bleeding from the fall that he took. He accesses a secret part of the lab and limps up to a pod, holding what seems to be Alexia. The pod is opened and Alexia, who was reported to be dead long ago, steps out. Alfred falls over as she returns and massive tentacles begin appearing from the base. One grabs the snowmobile, dashing Claire and Steve's hopes of getting out of this base alive. Alexia caresses her brother's head as she smiles at the wreckage. This is where the game kind of turns, as we leave our two heroes for someone else. Chris Redfield has been sent to Rockfort Island by Leon Kennedy, assumingly because of the email that Claire sent to him earlier. Chris scales the cliff face of the island in true Metal Gear style.
Kept you waiting, huh?
As Chris enters the facility, he meets Rodrigo, who has managed to escape into an underground tunnel. He tells Chris that Claire already escaped the island, and he thanks Rodrigo for his help.
Everyone's gone. I may be the only other person left.
Just then, the gulpworm attacks and swallows Rodrigo whole. Somehow, Chris is still determined to save him at this point, so we have to go fight the gulpworm. Now, this is kind of where the game takes a turn, and where people start to have problems with Code Veronica as a whole. This is one of the biggest complaints that I've seen about the game overall. So when we switch over to Chris in this section, we'll actually be heading through the military facility and Rockfort Island as a whole. We'll sort of be retracing the steps that we made as Claire, but also entering new areas of the facility that we didn't see our first time around. The problem here comes with inventory management. All of the items that we had on Claire when we beat Nosferatu will stay on Claire until she comes back into the game. So anything that was in her inventory is something that we just can't use anymore. Maybe we didn't know this and took 4 really strong weapons and a few healing items, and then Chris is left with barely nothing. This makes things really complicated, not only for Chris's playthrough, but for later in the game as well. As we continue to play as Chris, we'll eventually swap back over to Claire, and at that point, the same thing will happen. All of our ammo and weapons that we left with Chris will be off limits to Claire, and it's actually pretty important that Claire have a few particular items later in the game. This makes Code Veronica incredibly easy to soft lock yourself in. If you manage to leave all of your weapons or healing items with one character, then you're just kind of screwed. And it's the reason that there are so many posts like this online, people asking if they have enough ammo to beat the final fights, only realizing that they probably need to start from an earlier save or start over entirely. Now, I'm not going to defend this decision at all. It is definitively bad game design, especially because the game doesn't warn you about it whatsoever. Obviously, just making the player aware of this beforehand would fix things. It would remove a bit of the tension that's created when shifting over to a new character, and kind of spoil the fact that a big event was coming up, but it would also fix one of the game's biggest problems. While I won't defend this design, I will say that if you know about this issue beforehand, then the problem disappears. I knew about this problem because it's kind of impossible to research this game in any capacity without hearing about this mechanic, and I didn't have any problem whatsoever. The game also could have just had all the items in our character's inventory immediately get put in the item box. This would break immersion a little bit, but come on, the item box somehow magically transfers storage across facilities and rooms. It wouldn't be that big of a deal. The reason that I don't place a ton of weight in this issue is because it's only an issue on your first playthrough. It really isn't hard to work around it once you're aware of it, and sure, that's going to turn some people off. It effectively makes the game less accessible for an unaware audience. This is one of the reasons that there's been such a cry for a Code Veronica remake over the past few years, so that fans can have a chance to experience everything great about Code Veronica without the poorly designed mechanics getting in the way. This is why I suggest that if you are going to play Code Veronica, you should definitely look up when to swap your inventory and which items you should keep and take. As Chris, we have a boss battle with the Gulpworm, which isn't a difficult fight by any means. With the amount of firepower that we've hopefully stored by this point, we can easily take the beast down and save Rodrigo, who immediately dies after giving us the lighter back that Claire gave him. Chris can then head into the facility and use Alfred's secret underground entrance to get into a lab. Our overall goal is to enter the same room that Alfred entered earlier using some sort of strange emblem. We'll have to create this emblem over the course of this section as Chris tries to save his sister. This is done by finding two chemicals that create a solution to dissolve the key out of an emblem. As Chris is looking for this way out, he sees Alexia singing to her brother. We then see a familiar-looking man observing the same sight. He laments the fact that Alexia is awake. He notices Chris in the monitoring room and activates some new defense mechanisms that we'll have to avoid. These robots with sensors on them will sweep various hallways for Chris's presence. If we manage to get caught in one of their beams, then a hunter is sent to our location and we have to defeat it. It's an interesting mechanic that adds a certain level of intensity to the gameplay, but also rewards the player for being more measured in their approach. Once we reach an underground laboratory, the identity of the mystery man is revealed. This man, clad in black, is none other than Albert Wesker. That's right, Wesker somehow survived the Arclay Mansion incident. Since then, he has sworn vengeance on the remaining STARS members for getting in the way of his plan. That's just a secondary objective though, because Wesker is here to capture Alexia. An outside organization hired him to complete this task, and Chris realizes that he's the one who attacked the island at the beginning of the game. Wesker now has some sort of super strength and speed, seemingly infected from the T-virus all that time ago. That T-virus also seems to have infected his laugh, which is hilarious.
You have no idea how much I hate you. Now, die.
He taunts Chris with the fact that his sister is trapped in the Antarctic, and eventually gets distracted when Alexia reveals herself on a nearby monitor. We're attacked by a Bandersnatch and must make our way out of here. It seems that Chris and Claire have gotten themselves trapped in between a massive power struggle, a struggle between the Umbrella Corporation's largest family and the man that tried to betray them for his own means. Once we get the emblem, Chris gets access to a jet that will take him to the Antarctic base that Claire is at. As he leaves, there's this absolutely wild shot with the moon forming the background for Chris's jet. When we arrive, the facility has begun to deteriorate a bit, being fully infected by the tentacles that Alexia summoned. We can find a note here as Chris that sort of unravels the entire story of the Ashford family, this new virus, and Code Veronica. The memos in this game are sort of my favorite part about the whole thing. While Code Veronica seems to have far more cutscenes than the first few games in the series, most of its true story is hidden behind these memos. Piecing the story together for yourself becomes part of the story. What's happened to Alexia? What is Nosferatu? What's going on with Alfred? In that way, Code Veronica resembles a lot more of the early Silent Hill games than it does Resident Evil. The first few games obviously had this as well, but as I've said before, most of the memos in those games just amount to, I was just doing my job, and then I got bit by a damn zombie. But Code Veronica manages to weave a pretty interesting story that's massively tied into the history of the Umbrella Corporation itself. It keeps you guessing and constantly leaves holes that just aren't filled yet. To provide a bit of a summary, Alexander Ashford, Alfred's father, was obsessed with the family's founder, Veronica. In an attempt to resurrect the woman, he ended up creating twins, Alfred and Alexia. Alexia became a child prodigy and was immediately promoted to the chief researcher of the Antarctic facility at only 10 years old. Alfred and Alexia were not aware of their genetically mutated origins, but eventually found out about it at a young age. Alfred was enraged that they were lied to and that he was the genetically inferior twin. The two children locked their father away and used the T. Veronica virus strain on him. It had unintended effects since it was not allowed to mature for the required 15 years, and he became Nosferatu, the shade of a man that we fought on the helipad. Alexia, then becoming obsessed with regaining their family's former glory, injected herself with the virus and would not be reawoken for 15 years once the virus had fully matured. Alfred was distraught at losing his sister for this long, especially because of their odd and special relationship. This caused him to break and create a dual personality that could fill the absence of his sister. As we've seen now, Alexia has awoken, and the full power of the T. Veronica virus will be unleashed soon enough. As Chris, we can travel through the facility and see what's become of it since Claire and Steve's escape attempt. Since, unlike the past games in the series, these two stories aren't happening at the same time, the effects of our previous actions carry over. The entire facility has been consumed by ice, and that affects where we can go and what we can do. The overall goal here is twofold: to find 4 dragonfly wings and a body for those wings to be placed into. This will then form a key that will allow us into the final section of the game. That's sort of our end goal for the game, but along the way we find the reconstruction of the Arclay mansion that was referenced in earlier notes. It's a very strange, surreal overlap in this game. It feels like realities breaking and shifting together, personalities folding over and becoming one. It's just so odd to retrieve a map from this statue once again, especially because we're playing Chris for the first time since Resident Evil 1. Eventually, we manage to activate a crane that pulls Alexander's body out of the ice.
Alexia!
That is how I dispose of insignificant bugs, said the spider to the fly. How do you wish to die?
Bars. A massive spider then crawls out of the ice and attacks us. Luckily, we can completely avoid this thing because, fuck that. We have to then retrieve a key item from Alexander, one of the gems we'll need to access the final area of the game. One of the notes further into the facility goes deeper into the themes of this game, specifically Alexia's research into the queen ant. She used this to create the T. Veronica virus, but the queen ant also reflects the importance of the queens of the Ashford family, specifically Veronica and Alexia. It also mentions something important for later, that Alexander's body created a poison that could not be cured by the blue herb, and that an antidote was located in the facility. We can find Alfred's body down here as well, either succumbing to his wounds or being killed by his sister once she awoke. Once we get access into the Arclay mansion recreation proper, we can find Claire bound behind the staircase. Chris frees her with a knife, and this scene goes a little bit differently if we made a mistake in the Nosferatu battle earlier. If we got poisoned in that battle, we'll need a special serum to cure the poison, which, just like in Resident Evil 1, we'll have to run back in the facility to grab for the other character. Claire is then cured, and these two siblings have finally been reunited. Claire tells Chris they need to find Steve, but quickly Alexia shows up to ruin their plans. She calls them genetically inferior siblings before running off. A tentacle attacks the room and separates the Redfields just as quickly as they were brought back together. We then switch to Claire, and once again, we have the same inventory problem as before, which is worsened because if we don't have enough healing items for this next section, we are really screwed. Claire heads off to go save Steve, who's trapped in the nearby facility. We find him chained to a chair, much like Alexander Ashford was, but he quickly begins to mutate and break his binds. He transforms into a grotesque beast and chases Claire down this hall, where she narrowly manages to escape. Steve, Claire's love interest, is now trapped on the other side of the bars, while Claire sits terrified and saddened by the monster he's become. Steve almost manages to kill her, but something inside him manages to push through. He saves her life one last time and is pushed back by a tentacle. Steve, with some power of his will, was able to prevent the virus from fully taking him over, but not before dying from his wounds. I know people don't like Steve, and I mean, even his lines in this scene are incredibly bad.
I'm sorry, I cannot.
But you have to recognize, at least from a larger perspective, the arc of his character. Steve was annoying, but he also saved Claire at multiple points throughout the story. And maybe Claire wasn't really in love with him. Maybe it was the tensions of the moment that made her interested. Maybe it was the isolation of this environment, the intensity of the situation that brought them together. Would Steve and Claire have lasted outside of Code Veronica? Would Steve be getting groceries for their apartment, or would he become some mercenary, a paid gun for hire, too jaded and distant to ever let someone in again, choosing the weapons over humans at the end of the day? Probably the latter more than the former, but in this moment it makes sense for Steve's character. He uses the end of his life to overcome and save Claire once again. He tells us that he'll never let this happen again when he messes up in the airplane, and he keeps that promise.
I swear I'll protect you next time, Claire.
Sure, it's goofy, hell, it's even bordering on bad, but for some reason, it just works. We then jump back to Chris as we finished playing Claire for this game. He sees Alexia standing in the mansion entrance. Wesker confronts her, telling her to give him a sample of her blood. He wants the T. Veronica virus that runs through her veins. She determines that Wesker isn't worthy of its power, and then this game goes completely off the rails. Somehow, I guess because of the T. Veronica virus, Alexia transforms into a crazy stone beast that can summon flame. She destroys Wesker with a simple flick of her arm and causes him to run out the front door. Chris tries to make an escape, but he's caught in Alexia's path. We have to fight her here, which is pretty simple if we manage to keep the Magnum for this long. Alexia summons flame in this fight, but we take her down before she can do much. In killing her, we've obtained the last gem that we need to access a secret compartment in this facility. Chris then assembles the Dragonfly key and finds Claire locked in one of the cells. She tells Chris what happened to Steve, and she's clearly distraught. Claire is locked inside, but she tells him to activate the self-destruct system, which should deactivate the locks in the facility. I should note that she uses the word might here. Like, that's not a very good idea if there's a possibility that the place is going to explode and Claire is just trapped in this room forever, but okay. We head upstairs and activate the system, entering the security code Veronica, which honestly is kind of corny, but also kind of cool because it was right there the whole time. We have 5 minutes left to get out of here, but as Claire and Chris make their escape, Alexia has clearly survived the attack from earlier. Claire and Chris unlock a weapon, the linear launcher, the only weapon designed to take down the T. Veronica virus if it managed to go unchecked. Chris tells Claire to run, to get out of here, and her path out is blocked. We have to shoot Alexia before she kills Claire. If we don't do this in like 3 seconds, Claire is just thrown over the edge and we lose. Alexia then assumes her final form, a massive, grotesque beast, somewhat resembling a queen ant or bee or dragonfly, maybe all three. This fight is kind of a pain and probably one of the most annoying ones in the game. Alexia will summon small bugs that attack us repeatedly, swipe at Chris with large tentacles, and directly shoot at us. The bugs are the biggest issue because they prevent us from firing, so we can't just ignore them. We have to periodically wipe them out so we can get some shots in. We also need a ton of healing because we'll constantly be taking damage throughout this thing. Once she's defeated, Alexia transforms again into a flying beast, and we have to use the linear launcher to deliver one final shot at her. Once this is done, she explodes, and Chris barely manages to make it out of the facility before it's engulfed in flame. Claire already has a jet ready for them as the two siblings fly out of this place, leaving it behind for good.
Chris, promise me. Please promise that you won't leave me alone again.
I'm sorry, Claire, but it's not over yet. There's still something we've got to do.
You mean...
Yeah, it's payback time. We've got to destroy Umbrella. Now, let's finish this once and for all!
And this is the setup for the next part of the overall story. Claire and Chris are now officially heading to find Umbrella, to track them down and take them out. Like I said before, the X version of the game includes some cutscenes that weren't in the original. This is mostly in the form of how the game handles Wesker. In the X version, when Claire is heading back to the palace, Wesker meets Claire before Chris. He admits to attacking the island and thanks her for inadvertently helping his plans. He attacks Claire and tells her that he plans to kill Chris if he gets involved. They also make the fight scene between Wesker and Alexia a little bit more competitive on his side, instead of him just getting destroyed in seconds. This actually does work a lot better for the scene and makes sense for Wesker's exit from the game. When Chris is escaping the facility, he also sees Wesker capturing Claire. He tells Chris that since he isn't here for Alexia's work anymore, he just wants revenge. He plans to use Steve to gather the T. Veronica virus and even threatens to revive Steve. He's already been taken by Wesker's men. Chris tells Claire to get out of this place once again, and the two have an epic battle to finish the game. Chris manages to get the better of him by dropping steel beams on his head, but this doesn't take Wesker down. The two are unable to settle their beef as they're separated by a flaming pile of rubble. The additions that the X version of the game makes definitely sets up the story better for the future. It works Wesker into the plot in a way that doesn't seem like an afterthought, and they give him more significance in the grand scheme of things. Wesker will clearly come back into play in later games, so it's important that he's set up at this point in the story. There's also something worth talking about before we move on, and that's Wesker's report. This was a short story / memo that was released with Code Veronica. Wesker's report essentially builds on the history of the T-Virus, Umbrella as a company, and Wesker himself. Wesker wanted to be a researcher at Umbrella, but when he met Birkin, he ended up realizing that he was outmatched in scientific talent. He ended up joining the company's security team and infiltrated STARS. This was so that Wesker could keep them from looking too far into the company's activities. He was then given the task of luring them into the Arclay mansion and gaining combat data on the BOWs. Wesker already had a different plan in mind, though. He wanted to steal the Tyrant and defect to another opposing organization. He injected himself with the T-Virus, faking his own death until the Tyrant wiped out the STARS members. That didn't happen, of course, and he woke up to realize that his plans were foiled. He then vowed revenge against the remaining STARS members. After Resident Evil 1, Wesker was working in the same organization that Ada Wong was involved in. He allied with her to try and retrieve the G-Virus during the events of Resident Evil 2. After she fell from the walkway, Wesker saved her and the two failed to recover the virus before Hunk. They still managed to get a sample from William Birkin's body, and Sherry was eventually recovered by their organization, as we see in the epilogue of Resident Evil 3. A sequel report, Wesker's Report 2, was released with the remake of the first game. This goes a lot more in depth into the time that Wesker and Birkin spent together researching viruses at the Arclay Mansion lab. We're told that the progenitor virus was discovered by the founders of Umbrella, a virus that could recombine the genes of living organisms. Spencer, one of the founders, gave the lab over to Birkin and Wesker. Birkin ended up getting jealous after Alexia Ashford's name carried great prestige and success. The fact that she achieved great research at 10 years old and Birkin was miles behind infuriated him. The story began to circulate that Alexia died eventually, and this calmed him for a while. All this time, Wesker wonders why Spencer has kept them in this lab, and what his true motivations are. This eventually leads to him changing departments because he wants to infiltrate the organization and see what's really going on. Along the way, Birkin discovers the G-Virus by experimenting on a female test subject that's been there since the two received control of the lab. This turns out to be Lisa Trevor, the woman that we find inhabiting the grounds in the Resident Evil 1 remake. She was experimented on for years and eventually produced the G-Virus. She was disposed of and ended up making a home on the outskirts of the mansion. These two reports provide a lot of the context and lore that the series will carry for quite a while. It also, like the extra cutscenes from the X version of Code Veronica, builds up Wesker into a more important character than he was before. It turns out that he was involved in a lot of the research that caused the company to become what it is when we see it. Of course, there's no telling what else Umbrella is doing, how many labs they have, how many viruses they are working on. But Code Veronica as a whole manages to do a lot of really great things for the series. One of my favorite parts about the game is how it manages to toe the line in between genuine, terrifying horror and this sort of neutral ground, a place where intense action and interesting things can share the stage. It's part of what makes wandering around its environment so enticing. It's part of what makes walking its hallways so exciting. It's part of why you want to see the next chapter of this tale. The story, while of course goofy and over the top, is just told so well, and I never really imagined Resident Evil's story as all that serious in the first place. The first game carried a B-movie sort of tone from the beginning, so it only makes sense that we get into some pretty weird and strange territory. That's the kind of tone that I feel like Code Veronica just nails perfectly. Every moment in the story had me either engaged or laughing. And sure, sometimes I was laughing at Code Veronica rather than with it, but that just feels like it's all a part of the fun. There's one more game that I'd like to talk about before I wrap up my thoughts on this entry. The next game that would release with the Resident Evil title, and a game that is directly tied to Code Veronica. Resident Evil Survivor 2 Code Veronica was released in July 2001 in Japan for arcades, on November 8th, 2001 in Japan, and on February 8th, 2002 in Europe, both for the Sony PlayStation 2. Resident Evil Survivor 2 is sort of a sequel to the first Survivor game in that they're both light gun focused arcade style shooters, but that's really where the similarities begin and end. Survivor 2 was actually released in arcades, whereas the first game never was, so this sort of explains a lot more of its design. The first game carried a lot more of that Resident Evil structure to it. The goal was to collect items and move through areas to essentially get key items and solve puzzles to continue on. But Survivor 2 sort of shirks this whole thing in favor of an action-focused arcade game. And I'm okay with that in theory, because one of my main complaints with the first Survivor game, which I briefly talked about in my Resident Evil 3 video, was that it was too slow to be a shooter and too action-focused to build tension like a Resident Evil game does. It inhabited a weird middle ground that didn't really make sense for the series. Well, Survivor 2 is not slow at all because the game moves at a breakneck pace. Of course, this game was meant to drag quarters out of the pockets of kids in your local arcade, so the design makes sense in that regard. Instead of having an original story like the first game, Survivor 2 is basically a retelling of the events that took place in Code Veronica. In each stage, we have to pick up 1 or 2 keys, and then venture to a boss room where we defeat a more powerful enemy, and then move on to the next stage. There are 5 stages in total. The first stage, the prison, begins when Claire and Steve meet up outside of the cells. The two then battle a giant spider and move on. We continue this pattern across the 5 stages, moving into the military facility, palace, private residence, and eventually the airport. We fight Alexia's first form at the end of stage 4, but the final boss is actually the Tyrant. I guess the team didn't have the time to create the mechanics necessary to fight Alexia's final form. And that's kind of a bummer, because I was looking forward to that the whole time. Also, the game reveals that this was all actually a bad dream that Claire was having when we beat the arcade mode, so I guess it doesn't matter anyways. While playing the arcade mode, we have the choice of playing Claire or Steve. Whatever character we don't choose will be controlled by AI and will accompany us throughout the levels. They eventually just become a shield that takes damage for us, and it actually makes the game pretty easy for the most part. We can collect different weapons throughout the levels, special jewels that will give us a higher score, and of course the key items we need to progress. The game is pretty short, and it should be since it's an arcade game. There are some extra modes like the dungeon mode, which allows us to descend into various areas, killing enemies and collecting weapons until we face a final boss at the end. We try to rack up as much score as we can by collecting coins and killing enemies. There's also these really odd secret reports which we can find in the game and view in the menu. This one specifically seems to be scrawled into a wall written by Steve's father, but the scrolling speed is so low, it takes forever to read the whole message. The translation also isn't that great either, so the text ends up pretty broken. There's honestly not a lot to say about this game in general. Much like the first Survivor game, it's not very good. The whole thing is a pretty janky experience on controller. I, once again, didn't have the chance to use a light gun here, but I think that might have actually worsened the experience. The game is just so off the rails and not in a good way. I don't think it's quite as bad as Survivor 1 was, because at least this game isn't trying to create some new spin-off narrative about an evil Umbrella commander. The action at least makes the game somewhat fun, and unlocking extra characters, trolling through dungeons, and getting high scores on the arcade mode might hold your attention for a lot longer than the first Survivor. That being said, it's not exactly topping any Resident Evil charts or breaking new grounds for me. Because at the end of the day, this just doesn't really feel like Resident Evil outside of the models that were reused from Code Veronica. I can't exactly tell how critics or fans reacted to Survivor 2. Metacritic doesn't list any critics' scores, and I couldn't find any reviews for the game. There was one article that said the arcade version of the game was the most successful cabinet of the month in August of 2002, so that has to be worth something. Code Veronica is a masterpiece, and I genuinely believe that. But that doesn't mean that it's a perfect game. A game is not required to be perfect to be a masterpiece, and Code Veronica definitely has its downsides. Most of the reasons that people don't like it ring true in the final product. The evolution of the zapping mechanic doesn't really work very well in Code Veronica. It's mostly misused, it's misplaced, and it could have been integrated in a way that made it much more simple for the player. It makes your first playthrough of the game kind of difficult to get through, an uphill battle where the system that you're working in just doesn't feel fair. And this is a problem because if we feel like we have no opportunity to survive, then where is the survival horror? Of course, if you have certain information going into your first playthrough, or if you're playing the game for the second time, things are much different. And once those roadblocks are removed, Code Veronica feels like an entirely different game. It feels smooth, it's fun, the gameplay is engaging, it's great. The story is just such a good time. The game rarely ever feels like it's taking itself too seriously. Alfred's character was a highlight for me, a villain that was just so over the top, so broken and lost that he's completely shirked any sort of societal norms, wearing old military uniforms and laughing in high-pitched voices, playing with intruders over the loudspeaker. Wesker makes a great appearance in this entry as well. Since we've last seen him, he's become transformed. He's a shadow of his former self. Sure, he was a villain in Resident Evil 1, but now he's mutated, on a quest for power and revenge, one that seems like it will eventually consume him. Claire and Chris make a wonderful pair and deliver on a lot of fan service. The constant question in the last few entries of this series has been, where is Chris Redfield? And that question is finally answered in this game, and it feels like the story has moved forward, but we've also learned a lot about the past. We get to see who formed Umbrella, what became of them. New viruses are introduced in the game, and it sort of breaks the shackles of the here and now and lets us into the past. That's sort of a freeing feeling for the series, and there's moments where Wesker is confronting a transformed Alexia and she's literally summoning flame in front of her. Sure, you can get in the weeds here and say, how is that possible? How can a biological mutation cause someone to summon fire? But it ends up falling into the rule of cool. It's awesome, it works aesthetically, and it's great. It's all about context too, because if this happened in a different series, one that was more grounded and strict with its world, it'd be different. But here, it doesn't much matter in my opinion. The game also captures that atmosphere that is so tied to survival horror. Beautiful level design, fantastic modeling, great art, and a wonderful soundtrack to complement it. The visuals are next to none, upgrading nearly everything in the series. The cutscenes are great, and while they do carry a distinct B-movie charm, they also have that distinct early 2000s style that so many people pine for these days. Code Veronica grabbed my heart as soon as I started playing it, and I just couldn't put it down. And while I really do love the first 3 games in this series, Code Veronica felt like it just hit the perfect sweet spot for me personally. It won't be everyone's favorite, but for me it was a fantastic ride, and I can now finally see why so many people want a remake. Resident Evil Code Veronica was a critical success upon release. Most reviewers praised the upgraded graphics that the Dreamcast brought, and critics noted the atmosphere and presentation as great strong points. The game currently sits at a 94 out of 100 on Metacritic. The game was a relative hit with fans, selling 1.14 million units worldwide on the Dreamcast. This was massive specifically for the platform, making it one of the highest selling games on the system overall. Of course, these numbers didn't compare very well to the PlayStation 1 trilogy, but the Dreamcast didn't have as large of a user base as that platform did. After the release of Code Veronica, Capcom was already gearing up to release other projects in the series, and while the next Resident Evil would have a number at the end of its title, it wouldn't be Resident Evil 4. But we'll talk about that next time. Bye, Dad.